do. As the oldest national conservation organization in the country, American Forest has been protecting and restoring forests since 1875. One of our biggest goals is helping to plant more than 46 million trees throughout the country and around the world. Our policy work focuses on long-term protection of forests, such as increased funding for firefighting efforts, and we evaluate canopy cover in cities to raise awareness about the benefits of urban forests. We also educate the public through tree planting events, eco-travel adventures, and our award-winning magazine, which I encourage everyone to subscribe to. We recently took home awards for design excellence for all of our issues last year. And since 1940, the National Big Tree Program has been a testament to American Forest's legacy of leadership in recognizing not only the beauty of our biggest and oldest trees, but also the critical ecosystem services they provide as well. In case some of you did not know this, we have a National Register of Big Trees, which is our biannual publication every year in which we recognize the biggest trees in the country. And recently, we crowned more than 760 national champions last month on Arbor Day. And the register, as I said, not only recognizes the biggest trees, but it also recognizes that trees come in all shapes and sizes, and they grow in various environments. And one of the challenges with that is learning how to measure the circumference of trees of various shapes and sizes. So the primary reason we're hosting this webinar series today is to make sure the public has the resources necessary to measure champion trees. American Forest, we're excited for a new partnership with laser technology and helping to bring their world-class tools to our big tree hunters. And with that, I take it back to you, Paul.
Okay, thanks, Cherie. So yeah, just a little about who laser technology is and how we kind of got started. We did a really cool project for NASA in the early 90s. We custom built a laser that helped measure the distance and proximity for space dock missions. We are also responsible for releasing the very first recreational rangefinder, and we accomplished that by partnering up with Bushnell Optics and are still active today in designing their rangefinders for golfing and hunting. And then we also got our start in the professional measurement arena by developing the very first reflectorless handheld total station. This was actually designed for the U.S. Forest Service initially, and it did measure tree heights. It also did mapping integrated with GPS and had a built-in compass. So it was quite the unit, and we've certainly come a long way since. And this is just a quick snapshot of some of the latest lines of our products. We have the True Pulse series, which has been in existence since, I think, 2005. But, as far as what we can measure and the solutions we do, we can, do traverse boundaries, areas, diameter measurements, certainly tree heights, slope grade measurements, vegetation management is a very, very big market for us. Stem mapping, surveying, and last but not least, certainly we also have a software solution that helps do and calculate volumes of log decks. So with that, I'm just going to go ahead and turn this over to our keynote speaker today. Don, go ahead.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks, Cherie. Hi, my name's Don Bertolet. I'm a retired restoration forester from Grand Canyon National Park, where I was the vegetation program manager and oversaw 150,000 acres of forested ecosystems. I received my BS in Forest Resources Management from Humboldt State University and later my master's degree from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, with a specialization in GIS and remote sensing. I'm not one to brag, I'm just trying to show that I've been exposed to an array of ways to measure trees. Interspersed through this presentation, I've inserted questions slides so that you may ask clarifying questions throughout through using the chat feature. Next slide, please, Paul. The American Forest Champion Tree Formula probably is familiar to all of you. Since the inception of the Big Tree Program, the Champion Tree Formula has remained surprisingly constant with its odd mix of inches, feet, and quarter feet. One of the tasks assigned us in American Forest's Measuring Guideline Working Group was to take a look at the mix of units, at the features we assign values to, and to see if the current formula unduly assigned biases. After many permutations of features, units, and weightings, we have no better champion tree formula to recommend to date. That said, this presentation will be about the measuring circumference, or as used interchangeably, measuring girth. Next slide, please.
Line down, we're just having some technical difficulties. There you go.
There we go.
To paraphrase Joyce Kilmer, we think we shall never see a simple, concise definition of a tree. It was not so easy, we found, the task of defining a tree. The accepted definition of a number of federal and state land management agencies, conservation organizations, including American Forest, has been a variation of a tree is a woody plant having one erect perennial stem, at least 3 inches in diameter, at a point 4.5 feet above the ground, with a definitely formed crown of foliage and a mature height of at least 13 feet. But most managers and some conservation organizations find this definition falls short of the mark, and we will upgrade this general definition and some basic circumference guidelines for American Forest Big Tree Program. As a part of refining of the American Forest definition, we will specifically define where to measure height from, both for measuring circumference and for total tree height. This is a divergence from traditional forestry definitions where heights of trees and slopes were measured from the top side of the tree's base. We'll also approach determining single trees from multiple trees. Paul, next slide, please. Sorry, my screen went blank. Most will be familiar with the basic terminology as shown in this basic cross-sectional view of a tree. And I've highlighted the locations of the pith and annual rings in this view of a single tree cross-section. The American Forest current definition I've just read off, we wish to refine it by adding this. A tree is a woody plant having one pith line at ground level with a single set of concentric annual rings that surround the pith line, with each annual growth increment, and then blending that into forming an erect perennial stem at least 3 inches in diameter at a point 4.5 feet above the ground with a definitely formed crown of foliage. The basis for this refinement is biological. Based on plant physiology, a seed sends up a cotyledon, which grows into an apical meristem, which gets surrounded by an annual ring. This yearly addition of successive concentric annual rings growing around the meristematic tissue is also referred to as pith, forms the refined definition of a single tree. Next slide, please. If there are questions, I recommend this opportunity. Failing that, Paul can go to the next slide as appropriate.
Yep, doesn't look like I got any questions right now, Dan, so we'll move on to the next slide.
Very good. Here we'll try to identify basic circumference guidelines and thereafter identify guidelines for measuring larger or non-standard forms. Next slide, please. Well, let's start simply. In all 4 instances here, the blue line runs up the perceived central axis. whether the tree leans or not, and we measure the tree's circumference perpendicular to the central axis. In most common tree forms, we use perceived central axis and pith interchangeably. When we have a common tree form such as the first tree from the left, we follow steps 1 through 3 above. In the second tree from the left, we have a tree that leans. Steps 1 through 3 above still apply. In the third tree from the left, we have a tree on a slope. Steps 1 through 3 still apply, but where we measure from requires additional refinement. In the fourth tree, it forks above 4.5 feet. We still apply steps 1 through 3. So, for all common forms, steps 1 through 3 apply. Next slide, please.
Don, I actually do have a couple questions. I wanted to address them before we go any further.
Sure.
Going back to your original definition, there was a question about, does that include cacti?
My basic response to that is no. Specifically, what types of cactus are being referred to might have a bearing. Perhaps the person is thinking of a Joshua tree?
Yeah, I'm not sure it's not saying that. Another question that come through, if a tree has several stems, can you just measure the largest stem and count it as one tree? Or is the tree disqualified since it has 2 stems at ground level?
Well, that is something that we're going to deal with later if the person can wait until we approach that question.
Perfect.
That would work. But that is a good question.
Go ahead, Doug.
The remaining challenge, complex tree forms. We will look at ways of measuring the complex forms of America's champions fairly. To get an idea of the variety of forms, consider the trunk lines outlined in the diagram that follows. Next slide, please. The earlier questioner probably was looking at thinking of trees somewhat similar to number 3 and number 5. I would like to address this in a sort of a logical fashion, and then afterwards I'll see if I can specifically deal with the question asked earlier. Note that the 4.5 feet line remains constant across all forms. It's really forms 3 and 5 that diverge from the norm. Form number 3 forks just slightly above 4.5 and appears to be a fusion of 2 or more separate trees. Measure the circumference of the largest trunk, and record in inches. Form number 5 forks below 4.5 and is likely a fusion of 2 separate trees. Here you measure the largest trunk, record in inches. However, if form number 3 appears to be a single tree forking at 4.5 feet, measure the narrowest circumference below the fork and record in inches. If form number 5 appears to be a single tree forking below 4.5 feet, measure circumference of the largest trunk. For in our view, open spaces between trunks should not be included in circumference. I think this deals with the person's specific question, and the critical information is whether it appears to be a single tree or a fusion of 2 trees. Now that's a separate question in itself, and we'll deal with that again later in this presentation. If after everything's said and done it's not clear, then please submit questions to clarify that point. Next slide, please. We need to recall form number 4 to mind for trees growing on sloping ground. Next slide, please. Here, the diagram for girth measurement is for trees on sloping ground. Locate and mark a point 4.5 feet above where the trunk touches on the ground on the uphill side. Locate and mark a point 4.5 feet above where the trunk touches ground on the downhill side. Then measure midway between these points and take girth there. The red line in the diagram shows the location of that measurement. One should make sure that the tape is always perpendicular to the central axis of the trunk. Next slide, please. This is the diagram for girth measurement for a leaning tree on sloping ground. The root mass, the slope of the ground, the sheer size of the trunk, and the shape of the trunk may all enter as factors, making this job more difficult when measuring big champion status trees. The basic idea, however, is to take circumference at 4.5 feet above mid-slope and measure it perpendicular to the central axis. Next slide, please. This diagram is for girth measurement, but for a big leaning tree on sloping ground. The next this and the next diagram show what can occur for a tree on sloping ground with a trunk so large that 4.5 feet above mid-slope is still below ground level on the uphill side. Follow the steps listed in the diagram. Go to the uphill side, measure girth at the lowest point above any obvious root swell. Take girth at 90 degrees to central axis of trunk. Next slide, please. This is a diagram of a very large trunk on sloping ground. And to give a sense of scale, we've included an index along the right-hand side. Otherwise, this particular trunk would cover the whole view. So, as you can see, 4.5 feet from mid-slope would be well underground, and in cases like these, we have to discard our mid-slope position rule and measure from a point on the uphill side of the tree and try to stay above any root swell or buttressing if possible. With more advanced techniques, very large trees like these can be measured remotely, say at 16 feet, where the bowl is more characterized by a cylinder. Next slide, please. Perhaps now there are questions with regard to how to measure trees that fork above and below 4.5 feet.
Yeah, Don, I do have some questions here. I'm going to comment as well. So I've seen instances in very old trees where it is evident that two stems have fused and have developed a single set of concentric rings, yet have two piths. What do you do?
I'm having trouble imagining how you can have two piths and one set of concentric rings. I don't think. Well, I guess that comes from where was the how that was determined is difficult for me to understand, because to see the concentric rings is presupposes that the tree was cut down. I don't know if that's the case, but in trying to respond to this question, when a seed develops, it creates meristematic tissue that becomes the pith, and concentric rings start forming around it. I can think of no instance in which two trees started up growing next to each other and developed concentric rings around a single pith. In all cases that I have ever seen, those eventually diverge or remain contained. And at a certain point when bark inclusion occurs, where the tree begins forming annual rings around the pair, this may be the instance in which a person's talking, but that's a very, very hard thing to determine without destructive sampling, without actually following the tree. So my response again will be, when we talk about how to determine where the pith goes and delineating pith, we may be able to get at that answer. So hopefully I've dealt with that question. If we haven't, then we still have another opportunity to discuss that later in the presentation.
Okay, Don, I do have another question. I'm going to go back to the slide I believe that they're referring to, just to make it easier. It says, for form number 5 tree, measuring the largest trunk only for circumference, would we only measure crown spread in height also for the largest trunk only?
Yes.
Okay. We also have another question here. 2 slides back, let's see, when measuring a slope where the 4.5 feet is below both downhill and uphill sides. So let's go to there. I think it's this one here that they're referring to.
Yes.
Can you review how to distinguish that situation from the next slide, a very large tree? Where is the cutoff for choosing when a tree is very large?
Well, if you can go to the next slide, 4.5 feet above mid-slope doesn't even make it to ground level on a very large trunk, whereas in the previous slide, if you could return, 4.5 feet still occurs, well, in this case, below tree level as well. I guess the best answer I can give is when you're standing next to the tree and you can't measure 4.5 feet above mid-slope, you have to go to where you can measure it most appropriately, which is above as much ground swell as you can, and then you record the height above mid-slope that you did measure it to, all of this perpendicular to the central trunk's axis. Bob, if you have a response that's more in line with what the questioner is asking, maybe you can comment?
Well, I think you covered it pretty well, Don, but I would just add to what you said, in that if you're standing at mid-slope and you go up 4.5 feet, vertically up 4.5 feet, and then you're still below ground level at the uphill side, then you have no way that you can stretch the tape around the tree. That is to say, if when you start to stretch it around the tree at 4.5 feet above mid-slope, going with the central axis of the trunk, and you run into ground on the uphill side, then you can't measure the circumference of the tree. So you're really left with no alternative but to go to the uphill side. You just want to get close enough to the ground as you can without being on a root mass. There's going to be some judgment there, but for the most part, the curvature coming off of the roots on the uphill side, you get just above that, and then you're going to be able to stretch the tape all the way around, again, perpendicular to the central axis of the trunk. I hope that helped.
Yes, and one of the things that we probably haven't made clear is when we have abnormal sized trees and that's what the Big Tree Program is about, when you have situations where you can't measure at 4.5 feet, which is a standard, then it's appropriate in the nomination form to indicate what it was at 4.5 feet or your best measurement, and what that best measurement was at if it wasn't at 4.5 feet. And then that is part of the nomination record and also part of the certification process.
Great, John. I do have a couple more questions I'd like to go ahead and ask. Somebody's asking here, is river birch considered multiple trees or a single tree given it regularly splits below 4.5 feet?
That determination gets made by what happens at ground level. When we go back to the basic definition of a tree, we talked about a single seed creates a single meristem, which creates a single pith line at ground level. Now, if we have several river birch seeds that are adjacent to each other, and as they grow, they eventually get in bark inclusion, which surrounds all of them, that is still 3 separate trees, or however many seeds form that. That may be difficult to tell when seedlings are, let's say, an inch or two apart, but as they become a foot or two apart, it becomes much more clear in the way of the outline of the trunk. And so it's what happens at ground level that's really important there. What happens at 4.5 feet is also important, but that further defines what's happening with the tree once it's gotten above ground level.
Okay, and I have a comment here. It says, in Florida, we try to determine if the piths intersect above ground level. If so, we measure the narrowest circumference below 4.5 feet and record the height at which it was measured. It looks like it was just a comment made here.
Yes, could you repeat that? So I'm not sure I understood the point.
Sure, okay, I'm sorry, I'll try to read. So it says, in Florida, we try to determine if the piths intersect above ground level. If so, we measure the narrowest circumference below 4.5 feet and record the height at which it was measured.
Yes, I think that's also the current standard for measuring trees that fork below 4.5 feet. And we're not changing that. I believe I tried to state that back in the complex tree forms diagram. So I agree with that individual's comment.
Great. I have another question here. If a tree is alive and is very big but has a hollow area completely through, big enough to walk through, would this tree be disqualified, or would you simply measure the circumference around what's left of the tree, or only measure circumference of the larger leg?
You know, one of the things that my first answer to this is, boy, we really love photographs, and there can't be too many. Well, I suppose there could be, but if we had 4 photographs from 4 different quadrants of the tree, we can answer a lot of questions much better than the verbal description that I have right now of this particular tree. But in general, I will say that, and maybe this is a personal level response, we'll see if it becomes part of a general rule, but with the American forest, there is a 10-year cycle where trees are looked at and it's decided whether or not they still remain the champion. For practical reasons, if the nominator thinks that the particular tree they're nominating isn't going to last 10 years, then I suspect the certifier may also have that opinion and would probably deny that tree based on the length of time and it's a judgment call that it may live. Now, in the instance where this individual has described a larger, what were the last 5 words in that question?
It talked about if they could measure, or if they only measure circumference of the larger leg.
I think this almost sounds like the Ohio sycamore. In my mind, that's the way I'm going to answer this. I would say that it's only appropriate to measure the larger leg, as that is a standard rule already existing with American forests.
Okay. And just a couple more questions, and then we'll move on here. On the 2 leaning trees, one is measured perpendicular to the central trunk, and the smaller is not. Is that correct?
I'm going to say that leaning trees, I didn't catch the distinction between 2 leaning trees, but I can't think of any situation where you don't measure perpendicular to the central axis of the trunk.
Okay. Another question here. We've been measuring the smallest circumference between the root flare and any branches. Some of the diagrams look like the measure is taken around the root flare.
I personally like that distinction. I think measuring above the root flare is a fair measurement. In some larger trees, that root flare extends beyond the height of the person taking the measurement, and that becomes a difficult process. In those cases, we like to invoke higher order equipment and skill usage and measure remotely and through methods that we'll describe later in the presentation. But if the questioner has specifics in mind, whether for earlier diagrams, that would be helpful, but I hope I've answered that question. Bob, what's your perception?
Well, thank you, Don. The idea, of course, is not to include root flare if you can get above it. The problem oftentimes is that in very, very large trees, particularly trees that tend to buttress heavily like ball cypress, 4.5 feet above the ground level, you're still well into the root flare. So we worked hard over the past year to try to figure out how to deal with that situation from a measurement methodology, and I think that's basically what Don is going to show us how to do in the subsequent slide. Does that cover the point, Don?
Yes, I think so. If there are no further questions.
There's one more comment here. I'm going to go back to the slide I believe he's referring to, which is this one. He's saying, let's say that the number 5 is a single pith from ground line to the point of forking. Wouldn't it be most fair to the tree to measure the smallest common circumference of the trunk between ground and 4.5?
If that were the case, I think if everyone was listening closely, they would have heard me say, if the tree is if it's viewed as a single tree, and then later versus if it was viewed as 2 trees fusing. So if the person had a reason to believe that there was a single root system, a single tree, single pith line, and it forked above the ground level but below 4.5 feet, then that's true. He should measure well, I guess I'm presupposing a lot. Can you ask the question again?
So it's talking about a single pith from the ground to line to the point of forking. Wouldn't it be most fair to the tree to measure the smallest common circumference of the trunk between the ground and 4.5?
I would say yes. If it's viewed as a single tree, you would want to measure the narrowest dimension below 4.5. That's a standard current definition, and that's going to remain.
Okay, that looks like we got all the questions, which are some really good ones. So guys, keep it up, and if you have any, just to add to, if anybody does have questions, make sure you use that chat feature. If you didn't hear it before, you can just use that, take your mouse, roll over that top green bar, hit the chat icon, and we'll address your questions as they come in. So, Don, I think we're ready for the next part.
Okay, advanced measurement techniques. What kind of tree might need advanced measurement techniques? Well, one where height or girth physically prevents you from measuring circumference. How would we do that, and where would we measure its diameter? Next slide, please. Well, we can measure circumference if we can measure diameter, and it becomes a formulaic relationship between girth and thickness, and it's described by the formula circumference equals pi times diameter. If trees are perfectly circular, then this works, but in most cases, trees, by virtue of what goes on around them in the woods, will not be completely circular, but some measure of an ellipse or other shapes off of a circle. So what to do, and when that's the case, we have two methods. One is to measure with calipers, and the other is to use a reticulated monocular method. Next slide, please. For a tree that you can get to, one can measure with calipers, and here's an example of a caliper measuring the diameter of a tree, and it's designed to measure a trunk's diameter. If you take several readings around the trunk in order to average its diameter and then apply the formula shown in the previous slide, that'll give you circumference. For a tree that you cannot get to, next slide please. Here we have a two-trunk tree form that represents two separate trees. The yellow line is symbolic of the seam that forms oftentimes between two trees grown adjacent to each other. And utilizing a caliper, one would position one arm of the caliper near the seam and slide the other arm until it measures across the diameter. You would repeat this process after rotating around to the far seam, then average the two readings for the width. Next slide, please. The other solution is to use the monocular reticle method. There are several such devices that we're familiar with, and more, I suspect. RF's Inner Science Company's Macroscope 25 is frequently employed by some of us, or the Vortex's Solo RT. They both are capable of measuring width of an object at a distance. And the following slide depicts the view through a Macroscope 25. Note the graduated reticle in red framed on each side of the bowl. Count the number of gradations from left to right, and you can see that they're in groups of 5, so there's 5, 10, 15, and then there's 16, and let's say 16 and a half is the reading I get, and maybe you as well. To calculate the width of the trunk and thus the circumference, use the following process found on the next slide. Measure the distance from the monocular to the edge of the trunk with a laser rangefinder so you can get the distance to the center of the trunk. Then do as we just did, count the stadium marks, and we approximated 16.5. Enter in the reticle reading in the formula W equals dm over F, the distance, the monocular factor, and the width will be calculated. In this case, the number of marks was 16.5, the distance was 40. The monocular factor for the macroscope 25 is 300, and the formula gives a width of 2.2 feet. We want to average this reading with the second one oriented 90 degrees to the axis of the trunk, and then put it into the circumference equals pi times diameter formula to get the circumference, the calculated circumference. Next slide, please.
Don, may I interject something here?
Please.
Just to let everybody know, the manufacturer gives the F factor when you buy the equipment. They give you that factor to use, so you can use theirs, but you can also set up experiments to see if their factor is in fact correct, and I have found in some instances that you have to actually modify the factor that is given to you by the factory. Nonetheless, it's supposed to, that number for F is supposed to come from the manufacturer, in case anybody wondered how you get the value. That was it.
That is my understanding too, Bob, and I appreciate jumping in. That's absolutely correct.
I did have a question. When does width equal diameter?
Well, if you're standing about a foot away from a tree, the perceived width is not the diameter. You're not seeing the diameter that close, but the further back you get, the more closely the perceived width does equal the diameter, certainly from that view. Again, one would want to take more than one reading so that you get an average for the average diameter. I hope I've answered that question.
If I may jump again just a second, we use width and diameter fairly interchangeably. The idea, of course, if the tree is relatively circular, the diameter is the full distance through the center from side to side, and we would call that the width. Also, for the purpose of using the monocular, because the reticle monocular is basically set up to measure a flat surface that's 90 degrees to the line of sight. But if you stand far enough back from the tree, the diameter across at 90 degrees to your line of sight is a width. That's it.
We do have a couple more questions coming through. One person made a statement, I have not seen a diameter tape as part of the discussion. Is this no longer appropriate?
Well, in the measurement of trees for purposes of being entered into a big tree program championship, the more common and appropriate measurement is of circumference. When one takes a measurement of diameter from a D-tape, a diameter tape, one is getting an average, and the assumption is with the diameter that you're measuring a perfect circle. When you're measuring circumference, the assumption is that you're measuring the perimeter of that tree, not necessarily the diameter. So one is actual measurement, the other one is calculated. Did I cover that correctly, Bob?
Yes, basically, just remember that when you have a diameter tape and you read the diameter side, there's the other side, and that's just a linear measurement or a perimeter measurement or circumference when you consider it a circle. And all they have done in making the diameter tape or the diameter side is to compute the equivalent diameter for the actual circumference that was measured. You really haven't, you're not measuring something different. If you took the diameter measurement that you got, that you read off the tape and you multiplied it by pi, you would get the exact same number that you would have read from the other side of the diameter tape.
Yes, you know, I understand where the question comes from, or I think I do. Having measured thousands and thousands of trees in my career with the D-tape, I'm very familiar with the feel of it and the working, and I've measured 10-foot diameter redwoods and 3-inch diameter trees in the east that don't get much bigger than that. So yes, I think between Bob and I, we've answered that question. Next, Paul.
Okay, I do have one question here, and hopefully I can explain this right. If a tree is on a very steep slope with more than 9 feet between the lowest and highest side, can you use a monocular reticle method and measure, in effect, at 4.5 feet mid-slope? Let's see. Again, they kind of retyped the question, so let me just read it initially here. So on the low side, can you use the monocular reticle method and measure, in effect, at the 4.5 feet and turn in that as the measurement? Would that give it an unfair advantage over the tree simply measured at the lowest point at the ground level on the high side?
I'm not sure I understand that question. Did you get the grasp of it, Bob?
I'm a little unsure. If we went to the high side of the tree and we came across at that point, my understanding was that we would be 9 feet above the base on the low side. So coming up 4.5 feet from the low side, we'd run into the ground. And how would we use the monocular there now?
Well, the scenario where we have a measurement that isn't possible because we're not able to physically measure, the monocular is totally appropriate to use. If we're physically able to measure at 4.5 feet above the top side but not at mid-slope, then it's appropriate to measure from the top side, which would have been the answered in the figure that dealt with very large trees on a slope leaning.
Maybe we could ask the person who submitted the question to show us a diagram of what he or she has in mind at an internet address. It will give an email address, and then maybe you and I can put our heads together and give them a better answer. I'm just having a hard time visualizing exactly what that situation would look like.
Yeah, I'm in agreement. I'd be happy to do that, and so would Bob.
Yep, he just replied and said he'll email you guys later. So and we'll have that email up on the last slide. So I think we're ready to move on, Don, if you want to finish up here.
Okay. Well, after the next slide, we'll see if the what we call the biggest challenge remains, and that is distinguishing between single trees and multiple trees. Well, we're going to return to the definition of a tree. Next slide, please. And I'm going to read what a tree is. It's a woody plant having one pith line at ground level and a single set of concentric annual rings that surround that pith line with each annual growth increment. Now, is this something that we've decided independent of the whole world? No. Actually, others have. And if you can move to the next slide, Paul, we'll give you an example. This particular slide is of a diagram taken from the Finnish Society of Forest Science through their Forest Research Institute, and appears in the periodical Silva Finnica. And they list common tree definitions for national forest inventories in Europe. If you look at the blue dots in the diagram, you'll see that they represent the ground line and also the point at which their presumed central axis or pith line intersects the ground line. For Finnish definition, this constitutes 3 separate trees based on the number of pith lines at the ground level. I will note, however, a big tree program with the American Forest does not agree with the 4th individual tree they list there, where it's where you have a tree that forks below breast height. That in that case, we only measure the largest of the 2. Well, in that case, we would measure the narrowest diameter, because that is one tree going into 2 forking below breast height. In any case, we're in agreement with the blue dots in the diagram, and that is how we make those determinations. Next slide, please. This is a real-world example. As you look at this stump, well, I can tell you what I see, and that's what I'm going to relate. And perhaps if there are folks that see it differently, they can bring that up in questions either during this presentation or separately afterwards. But when I look at this stump, I see that we are at or near ground level. My interpretation is that there were 3 seedlings. They grew in close proximity to each other. 2 of the 3 seedlings have distinct pith signs. The one on the left has rotted away and is missing. The center pith is present, and the right pith is indistinct but still present. The left seed was outcompeted and died before a decade had passed. The center seed didn't encounter the right seed for almost 25 years, and the right seed was suppressed at the but of the same age when they grew into each other. At that point, each began pushing against each other's annual ring increments, extruding them outwards. Paul, if you can mouse over the area of included bark in between the right and center pith. If you go beyond the included bark, you'll see that the annual rings become rather amorphous, both above the included bark and below. That's a zone of extrusion. After that, successive annual ring increments begin a period of bark inclusion, and where the mouse is right now, you can just about see, oh, I'm sorry, that's my mouse. If you count in 5 annual rings from the outside bark, you'll see that it would appear that the tree has grown over itself, and eventually you would see this as a single tree if you only measured in, let's say you took an increment bore and only went in, let's say, a ½ inch. You would only see 5 annual rings, and it would appear to be a single tree. But if you were to bore in 2 inches or 3 inches or 4 inches, you would eventually go through that zone of that amorphous zone of indistinct annual rings, and perhaps encounter either the area of bark inclusion or actually into the center of one or the other trees here. So I see this as at one time 3 trees, 1 tree died, 2 trees remain, 1 is dominant, the other is codominant or suppressed. You know, we earlier talked about ISA and that being an organization for arborists. Arborists have electronic devices that could be used in testing soundness, and if such were employed on this tree before it was severed, I believe a graphic depiction that comes out of some of the what do they call them, sonic tomography devices would show these amorphous zones as having less density or differing densities in any case, and portray this as more than one tree. Next question, please. So one of the things that we've worked with in the American Forest Measuring Guidelines Working Group is how to make a determination how many trees are there. And this is a general rule that we formed. We follow the central piths down the trunks of 2 boles shown below in the next slide. If they intersect above ground level, we have 1 tree. If not, we have more than 1 tree. Here we have a photograph that Bob took of a oak tree that's got double trunks, and this was taken in a park nearby his home. In the second photograph, actually I believe Bob might have done this. He delineated where he thought the pith line would be on these 2 different oaks, and in this photograph it's fairly clear that they are some distance apart. I'll add for scale that the 2 trees separate above 4.5 feet. So by the old rule, this tree would have been measured at 4.5 feet and called a single tree. We're proposing that this is 2 separate trees. It shouldn't be measured at 4.5 feet. And we can propose methods on how to properly measure this, but measuring it as 1 is not a proper way. Next slide, please. Actually, Paul, can you go back 1? One of the things I wanted to say is that as you look at these 2 oaks, right now we're seeing a snapshot in time, and it appears that on the right tree where the pith line is delineated, that tree is eventually going to encompass the tree on the left, and we call that an area of inclusion, bark inclusion. Maybe in 50 years from now, the bark will completely circle both, it'll appear as 1 tree. And in fact, like the stump before that we talked about, how it will eventually develop annual rings around all of it. This is an intermediate view of that happening. Okay, now we can move on to the next tree. Now, this is, I think, a challenging tree to measure. And I would ask all listeners, question number one, how would you draw the pith line in each of the trunks here? And I think that would be an absorbing task in itself. Then the second request would be, show me where the pith line of each of these trunks is at 4.5 feet above the base. That's also not entirely easy to do. But at the point in time where I ask you, where are the pith lines at ground level, I'm interested in how many listeners think that the pith lines of all these trunks intersects the ground at one point. And I'd be interested in having extended conversations on the email level after the program with regard to that. My own perception here is that this tree is indeed the Texas State Champion live oak, and when it was measured in accordance with the rules at the time, and it was probably measured about calf high on the individual standing in the front of it, which was in accordance with the old rules. Next slide, please. Here we have the Louisiana National Champion Bald Cypress. I initially titled this slide in the plural, but right now it's currently listed as a tree. I recall seeing the backside of this fusing National Champion Bald Cypress, but actually I think they are too. I think they have an entirely different appearance on the backside, but nothing that I saw would lead me to believe that there was a single pith serving both bowls here, front or back. They are a stunning pair. Those lucky enough to see it in person have to be impressed, especially when you see a person in them. I'll probably say this for each of the following examples to come. It would be great when surroundings permit to have 4 image quadrants. Like many trees fusing at or near the ground level, the root systems so anchor them that it's only when the inherent flexibility of the bowl permits the growing pressure to separate them that allows them to be separate trees that they are. I would hazard to guess that these two trees are of separate ages, perhaps by 100 years or more. Regarding my placement of pith in orange here and the circumference delineations in yellow, they're just my best estimates. I was not there. I have not seen these in person, but from what I see in the photograph, this is my best estimate. I'd be interested in receiving comments again during this presentation or after with regards to how others see this. I think we can work at ways of characterizing buttress tree forms such as this one more fairly. Perhaps in the next slide, please, Paul. Here we have a diagram of a large buttress tree, and much as the person did according to the existing rules of the time, it was measured at 4.5 feet around both trees. We suggest that you would measure the largest single tree and measure it as best as possible at 4.5 feet, and then include as part of the nomination form a measurement taken with a monocular reticulated monocular at 10.5 feet, as suggested in the drawing, where the conical shape yields to the more cylindrical shape of the rest of the tree. Next slide, please. Here we have the Oregon's national champion walnut, black walnut. You guys can feel free to call me on this because I don't have another image to support my guess, but I believe this is at least two separate trees with the back left bowl having a separate pith. It's entirely possible that had there been another image, one quadrant around the pith location might have been better judged. Again, it would have been nice to have more images. Perhaps a person showing where they took the circumference at and a reference object for a scale. Next slide, please. Until I saw a large enough image of this California State Champion Canyon live oak, I had no idea of the scale of it. But I noticed the people in the picture and I went, wow, just uncontrolled. What a huge tree. For several reasons, I believe it was measured correctly by the rules of the time, but suggests that this is arguably three separate trees as demonstrated by my pith estimations in orange here. Again, more images would have taken much of the guesswork out of this one, but I'm not sure how different my estimations would have been. Next slide, please. This is a peach leaf willow, at one time a national champion. It no longer is, and I think that's a good judgment. I don't know if it was a matter of other trees having a larger diameter. I'm not sure, but I would ask the listening audience, how many of you think this is a single tree with a single pith at ground level? Again, we would love to hear from all audience members on this. If they would wish, they can certainly contact us at the contact information listed at the beginning of this presentation.
Yeah, we actually do have one question and comment, and it's referring to the looks like the black walnut we had.
Oops.
Right there.
Right there.
If the Oregon black walnut are multiple trees, how would you measure circumference?
Well, I think my suggestion here is that there's one main trunk. You know, if you measure below the line, below the DBH, the temptation is to measure the circumference at the narrowest part. But I think one has to make the decision that if one makes a decision that this is 2 or 3 separate trees, then one has to select the largest trunk and measure it as representative of the tree. In this case, it's difficult to tell whether it be the left bowl or the center bowl, and it'll be above where one can measure 4.5 feet, so it would be best measured with a reticulated monocular, and in the nomination form, measure the lowest diameter below 4.5 feet, and then also provide the single measurement by the monocular with reticle on the central trunk if that's deemed to be the largest of the 3. Bob, do you have
Don, may I interject something? Don, may I interject?
Please.
This is an example of where you have no choice other than to go to the reticle monocular with reticle or calipers and start off and measure what you think is the diameter of the central or the largest trunk, and then convert the result to a circumference. there's no way of course, just putting a tape around the entire form, because then you obviously have included the other potential trunks. So this is the real test of the monocular or the caliper-based solution. You're really going after what you think is the diameter of that primary trunk, and then converting it to a circumference. That's it.
Very good, Bob. Next slide, please. I suspect the questioner may also have similar questions with regard to this one, and I think our response is still the same. When we look at ground level, to me it's apparent that there are 3 separate piths, and this is an example of 3 separate trees. The red dots show where it was probably measured according to the existing rules at the time. I'm suggesting that it be appropriately measured at the yellow dashed line as representing the point where the largest of the 3 would be measured at. Perhaps as I look at it now, I might lower the yellow dotted line to get the minimum dimension, but essentially the point is that there are 3 trees here. You only measure the largest of the 3.
Don, we did have a question regarding the peach leaf.
Yes.
Let's go back. Does the peach leaf willow appears to be a situation of retrenching with multiple epicormic sprouts emerging from a common base? Looks like it's just a comment.
You know, we're developing a rule where we make our decisions based on adjacent radius, the radius of adjacent trees, like the next smaller radius. And if it's apparent that they're more than that radius apart, then they are separate trees. The fact that they come from the same trunk, and I can kind of see the logic in that. The fact that they come from the same trunk does not mean that they are one tree. I will hazard my judgment here that I'm looking at 4 trees or more.
Okay. Just as another follow-up question, could the difficulty in measuring these trees deter them from being nominated? And so I could see the difficulty in trying to figure out the crown spread and height if they are 3 separate trees.
Yes. My response to that, and this is a very pertinent question, at the nomination level, we encourage participation. And it's difficult to make these judgments, certainly at the public level where one may or may not have significant exposure to odd forms like these. I encourage nominations for all trees, and we are hoping at the certifying level, in most cases that'll be a state agency or organization that is recognized by the American Forest National Big Tree Program, to make those determinations, or at the national level itself as one starts looking at national registry trees.
Don, can I interject again?
Please.
One of the tasks that Don and I have been involved with, and along with others over the past year as part of the Measuring Guidelines work group, is to figure out how to solve these very complex problems, mathematical problems associated with these bizarre complex forms. We have a guidebook in draft form that amounts to about 75 pages, and we're afraid we're going to get hung by everybody out there when they see it. So we may not give out our addresses. But all joking aside, it's not a trivial exercise to try to tease apart the trunks and to figure out really what to do about such a large form. In the past, I think we've sort of just gone ahead and done the simplest thing, and we don't want to do that anymore. We want to get ever more scientific, but we also want to have the instruments that do the job best. We want to have the techniques that do the job best, and we want to figure out how to apply those techniques through the simplest protocols. And that'll be coming out probably in the fall as a guidebook to measuring these forms, and it'll be explained at several different levels, 3 levels, something appropriate for the public, something appropriate for certification, and then when we really get into these extremely complex forms, we have an advanced level. And hopefully we can solve the problems that way. That's it.
Thank you, Bob. That was well said, and if I'd have thought about it, I would have mentioned it too. And hopefully, come fall, the guidelines will be announced and make things much clearer. In conclusion, well, American Forest Big Tree Program was established in the 1940s and responded to the need recognized at the time as a serious need for America's big trees. The initial formula still remains today, and there's no real serious moves planned to change it. The continued involvement of the public is a bulwark of the Big Tree Program, and we'll continue to encourage that. But much has changed in our world since the 1940s, and I would ask the question, where's the Big Tree Program today? Well, American Forest has created a measuring guidelines working group to recognize new standards of excellence in measurement. The measuring guidelines that the working group are working on are a work in progress. With development in optics and electronics, it's opened up new vistas for the field of tree measurements. Optical instruments such as the reticle monocular enable us to measure diameters for trees we can't get a tape around, and also where we can. 35 years ago, I used a Hewlett-Packard electronic distance meter in land surveying. It was transported in a suitcase-sized padded case, but it wasn't transported very far on foot. 25 years ago, I used a laser rangefinder called the Criterion 300. You folks may have seen an example of it in earlier slides. I used it to traverse timber sales in dense Alaskan forests. Its weight units were in pounds. By 10 years ago, laser rangefinders had found wide public acceptance, especially among hunters, golfers, and big tree hunters. These are measured in ounces. American Forest Big Tree Program wants to keep up with these rising technologies and wishes to provide accurate, replicable data for America's exemplary trees, and to meet the need of its public, its academics, and researchers, both here in the U.S. and in the world. Thank you, Paul. Time for additional questions.
Great. Yeah, we're kind of running out of time here. I just wanted to let everyone know, of all those who are attending live right now, you are entered to win one of 2 TreePulse 360 lasers. And please join. Actually, we have one more webcast that's going to be June 3rd, and that will actually give you up to 3 chances. If you attended the one we had last week, obviously this one, and the one next week that will, again, give you 3 chances to win up to 2 lasers that we're giving away. So with that said, I just want to end with this, this contact. You know, there are some further questions. Please send them to this email, bigtrees@americanforest.org, or write to Don or Bob, that are guest speaking today. Any additional information, this will be recorded and it'll be available on the American Forest website. And if there's any information, anybody's interested in the technology, you can visit lasertech.com. So we do have the recording from last week that should be up in a day or so. So it takes about 5 to 7 working days to render the recording and make it available for viewing. And I believe the PowerPoint material will be available as well. So I did want to say thank you to Sri from American Forest, and of course Don and Bob for guest speaking today. And hopefully we'll get everyone online next week as well. Thanks again, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.